what was the discovery of the Mass like, coming from a Baptist background, which has really nothing to do with the Mass? Unlike Anglicanism, that kind of resembles the Mass, the Baptist faith has nothing to do with the Mass. So what was that like?
In fact, it denies that it's a sacrifice. It denies it's anything other than just crackers and grape juice. And that's how we just remember what Jesus did for us. I remember the Baptist services, and I'm sure you are quite familiar too. Whenever I give my talk on the Eucharist, I always start out by explaining what I knew it to be when I was growing up, where you get a little tray passed around, kind of like the offering plate. You don't go up to the front. You just get a little tray passed around. You pick up a piece of saltine cracker and you hold it in your hand. And when everybody gets a piece, everybody stands up and the pastor prays. And it's usually a very devout prayer about thanking Jesus for giving his body for us on the cross. And we eat this to remember. That's the key word. And we eat the cracker. And then another little tray comes along, and that's the grape juice in a little shot glass. And you'd take that little shot glass and you'd hold it. And when everybody had it, the pastor would stand and pray again and thank Jesus that this reminds us, this wine, I mean grape juice, reminds us that you shed your blood on the cross for us. And then we'd all drink that. And then the service was pretty much over after another hymn. When we were kids, we knew that there was always a little bit of grape juice left in every one of those glasses. And so we would go up and down the pews, my brothers and I, getting the last few drops out of every one of those glasses. And why my mother let me do that, I have no idea. But that just shows that there was no sense of the reverent. There was no sense that this crackers and grape juice were anything other than crackers and grape juice. And it was just a simple thing that we did 4 times a year to remember what Jesus did for us. Then, when I grew up a little more, I found out that Catholics actually have a piece of bread and they put it up on their altar in a gold thing that looks like a big star, and they all bow down and worship that piece of bread. And that was shocking to us, because to us that was not only idolatrous, but it was stupid. How can you bow down and worship a piece of bread? We know that Jesus is risen from the dead. We worship a living Christ. The Catholics, they worship a piece of bread. And we used to I think back on it now with great sorrow, but we used to call it the cookie Christ, that Catholics worship a cookie Christ. And so then when I came to the point of this whole conversion process, it wasn't around the Eucharist. For me, it was more around the issue of authority, because we had Bible alone, and I realized that couldn't work. It started to unravel, because every time I'd get together, even with my best evangelical friends, we'd argue about what the Bible meant, and there was no final arbiter, there was no final judge, and it was just, well, we agree to disagree. Well, so I realized the Bible alone, you could never start a religion based on a Bible alone, on a book alone. When Martin Luther decided to try that, now we've got thousands and thousands of different organizations all reading it for themselves and coming up with their own ideas of what it means. So the issue of authority was one for me, but when it came then time, as my wife and I went through one issue after another, the papacy, the priesthood, confession, when we got to Mary, and then we got to the Eucharist. Now the Eucharist was a whole different animal. And there we had realized that there's like a sliding scale from A to Z. And it is either crackers and grape juice, or it is the body and blood of Christ. And Christians from the very beginning always said that it was the body and blood of Christ. The idea of crackers and grape juice is only 500 or so years old, and it's an innovation never heard of before in history of Christianity anywhere. So I had to struggle with that then. And I knew that I had to choose wisely, because if it is just crackers and grape juice, and I become a Catholic and bow down and worship that, then I'm an idolater. I'm worshiping an idol, bread and wine. But if it is the body and blood of Christ and I make fun of it and call it the cookie Christ, then I'm going to be in big trouble on Judgment Day. Either way, I have to choose wisely, because either way, if I'm wrong, I'm in trouble before God. So that stimulated the whole study especially biblical, but also of patristics, the fathers of the church. And I didn't care about guys in the 4th or 5th century. I cared about the guys that were taught by the apostles. What did they teach? What did they believe? What did they know? So if
Yeah.
I could find a missing link in the 1st and 2nd century, then I didn't have to become Catholic. But the more I studied, that I found out that those early centuries, they were very Catholic in their understanding of the Eucharist and everything else too. And then my wife and I looked at each other and says, well, why do we believe something very different than the first Christians? Before there was even a New Testament, they all believed that it's the real body and blood of Christ at the hands of the priest on an altar.